Hi, I'm Sir Peter Wanless. I'm the Chief Executive of the NSPCC. Welcome to the Inspiring Leadership Show, and here's our host, Jonathan Bowman-Perks.
Well, Peter, thank you very much indeed. And firstly, congratulations on recently getting your knighthood, and thoroughly well deserved for the work your team and you, and it's often, it's given to the CEO, but you're very gracious to the amazing team you've got around you in the NSPCC, one of the world's probably most famous charities. But what a life you've had. You and I have known each other for a few years now. You've been CEO for coming up 8 years. And I know about your great passion about Somerset County Cricket Club, and you've given your heart and soul to them as much as you have to the NSPCC. Also, you're now a trustee of the Five Rights Foundation, an advisory board member of the National Leadership Centre, looking into leadership in public life, the CEO of the Big Lottery Fund before that, the director of the Department of Education in a number of different roles. Your time studying at Leeds University, doing your BA in International History and Politics. So what a fascinating life you have. And let's perhaps talk about the NSPCC and particularly how a charity has coped in this pandemic, because it's hit everybody very hard, but particularly charities and people giving money when they're feeling a sense of scarcity.
Yeah, so the NSPCC's charitable purpose is to prevent cruelty to children. And these last sort of 12 months or so have been really challenging times for lots of children and young people. And people have talked about children being at risk of being the hidden victims of the pandemic. So for an organisation like the NSPCC, we have felt an incredible duty and responsibility to be there for children at the most challenging of times. We're a charity that's funded overwhelmingly from voluntary donations of one kind or another. And so you can imagine the impact that lockdown had on our ability to raise funds in many and varied ways that were planned this time last year, which weren't able to take effect. So there was a vital need for our services and a real challenge for how we were going to organise ourselves to deliver them. So it's been hard work, but I've tried to sort of lead the organisation against three really consistent principles in order. So the first is the charitable purpose. We must be the best we possibly can for children and young people, and we must make the best impact we can for children. Secondly, though, we need to look after our people and one another. So this great array of volunteers and staff that are so committed to making a difference for children, to really purposefully consider how they are balancing the pressures and challenges in their life, whether that's bereavement, vulnerable elderly relatives, education from home, all these competing pressures. So that kind of deliberate sense of looking after our people and one another, and that kind of wider well-being, so we can be the best we can for children. And then thirdly, securing the finances of the organisation, because as I say, we depend so overwhelmingly on donations. How could we keep the show on the road? Because if we don't have a really careful eye to the budgets and the money coming in and the money going out, we're not here to give the support we need for the children. So those principles have really endured, I think, and served us well through this prolonged crisis, and keep coming back to the fact that it is a crisis for the children and young people that we're here to address, as opposed to it being a crisis for the charity.
Yeah, that's a lovely way of looking at it. And with all these variety of things that you've been involved in and you've given yourself to, where did the values and the sort of the foundational makeup of you come from? If we take you right back to the young Peter Wanless, who's doing what you're doing now, making a huge difference to the lives.
Sorry.
No.
Well, I was always kind of fascinated by politics and the idea of influencing important things, and used to love sort of reading the newspapers and arguing with the teachers and all of this. sort of thing. So I have a bit of a chip on my shoulder about it, but I failed the civil service fast stream entrance exams. I was very good on the kind of maths questions, which tested one bit of the IQ, but my English skills weren't classically taught grammar. I could write you a really good story, but I didn't necessarily put the words in the right order. And so that annoyed me a bit, but I got in to the civil service and they offered me a job in the cabinet office, and I thought that sounded really glamorous. So but I turned out I wasn't taking the minutes at the cabinet meeting. I was actually in a rather obscure bit of government called the Management and Personnel Office at the time, which was about the leadership and management of the civil service, which very rapidly got shunted into the Treasury. And there I was in the Treasury. So I can't pretend that there was a huge kind of, it was the politics and the kind of game of politics that excited me. And I quite rapidly got a job in private office, working directly with ministers, and I was working all hours. Most of my 20s, I was working directly with government ministers, organising stuff, kind of scheming, this, that, and the other, in the middle of the Treasury, in the middle of the spending rounds. You know, it's a fantastic, extraordinary place to be. Saw all sorts of famous politicians close at hand. Fast forward a little bit, and to cut a long story short, I sort of ended up in the Department for Education, and that was around about the time I became a father, and those two things together, it suddenly became less of a game, more a rather serious and important issue about whether and how children were being well served by the country that they were growing up in. And that took my kind of engagement and interest in government to a whole new and more rewarding level, which I think was always there. And I often find myself now talking about my mum and the deep influence that she had on me, because she had a really strong sense of moral purpose and set of moral values, which were a complete frustration to me when I was growing up. And I never really appreciated my mum. She just sort of got in the way, and here I am now, almost all the time, every day, talking and thinking about my mum, who never got to see me, you know, running a charity. But from the education department, I was, you know, 2 steps removed from the real action, I would say, sort of in the classrooms and in the communities. I moved from there to the lottery, which was 1 step removed, because that was distributing cash to community groups and fantastic causes of one kind or another. And then when the opportunity came to lead a charity that was right at the centre of giving children the start in life they deserve, that was just amazing. And so looking backwards, there's an incredible logic to my career as I've moved progressively closer to children and the lives they lead, and also progressively eastwards across London as it happens.
Yeah, and it is interesting that rather eccentric character, Steve Jobs, who on the one hand was brilliant, on the other hand was quite living an alternative reality kind of force field that he had. But he did say it's only later in life, and particularly as he knew he was dying, that when you look back over your life, you join the dots up going backwards. And you make sense of what goes on, though at the time you might not know what your life meaning and purpose is, and we'll talk about that later on. As you were growing up, and you know, your son Bertie was born, what would you say were some of your proudest moments in your career and maybe in your private life, and also what were some of the darkest moments, and what did you learn from both?
I think my proudest moments have really been around have mostly come later, as I have influenced activities at a system level and at a kind of one-to-one level that have made positive, life-changing contributions to children and young people. So that is one of the great privileges of running a charity and delivering services like Childline, that you are on a day-to-day basis, providing an environment in which young people can come forward, share concerns and worries that they have. You can find lives that are completely off track, and by putting together the right expertise and intervention, help those young people see that what's happening to them is not their fault at all, and get them back on track. So the ability to be associated with that sort of difference, probably my proudest moments. Darkest moments, I tend not to sort of dwell on the negatives. I mean, there have been times when I've felt completely kind of incapable and out of my depth. I was, I got on very fast, notwithstanding that kind of false start in the civil service entrance exams. I got promoted quite quickly, and there was a time back in the mid-90s. I was working for Michael Portillo. He was Secretary of State for Employment, and he was looking for, they were called Head of Information at the time. They'd be a kind of comms director now. And I thought, what a fantastic job. And he was struggling to find someone to do that job. I was running his private office, and I sort of joked, oh, I could do that. And the permanent secretary said, well, you should apply. And so I applied, and I got it as a consequence of what was deemed to be a fair competition at the time. And suddenly I found myself with quite a big directorate of people that I was responsible for, but quite a lot of enemies, because it was seen very much as a professional operation. The Government Information Service had lots of people who were coming up sort of through that profession, who saw these jobs as theirs, and in most government departments these areas were rather protected to the information specialists. And I felt very strongly that policy and communications needed to integrate really effectively, and it's not just the substance of the policy, but it's the way in which it connects with real people's lives that matters. And quite often you would find this situation where the policy people would think they developed a brilliant policy and blame the comms people for it landing as a disaster, and the comms people would say, well, you've developed a policy which just doesn't work. So I felt I could do something about that, and I was at an age where you don't know what you don't know, and I'm quite proud of my audacity actually to put myself into that situation, be given that responsibility, and then sort of get on with it. But it was controversial. There were stories in the papers at the time about, was this a sort of political appointment, Portillo's favoured child or something? And there was one evening when there was a dinner at 10 Downing Street, which John Major, who I'd worked for previously as a Treasury minister, was hosting an evening for a load of regional newspaper editors. And it turned out, though we didn't know at the time, that this was the evening before he effectively resigned and said, put up or shut up. If anyone in the party really wants to run against me, then now's the time to do it. And he was trying out his lines, I think, on these newspaper editors and trying to convince them that the sort of 92 to 95 was a brilliant period of reform for the Conservatives, notwithstanding the ERM disaster and everything else. And he looked around the table, and he was reaching a kind of crescendo of all these achievements that he was really proud of, John Major, as Prime Minister. And he said, but if there's one thing that really epitomises what I have stood for as the Prime Minister, it's happened in the Department of Employment. Now, who's here from the Department of Employment? And look around the table, and everyone's heads are down, and I'm thinking, oh gosh, that's me. I wonder what he means. I'd been in the job sort of 3 weeks, and when he saw it was me, oh, Peter, And this recognition, and he's winding the clock back sort of, what, 5 years or 6 years from when we worked really close together. And he must have thought, well, I really know this person, so we'll be attuned. He'll know the answer. Come on, Peter, tell everyone, what is it that's happened in this part of employment that is such a life-changing consequence to so many people in this country? And I really didn't know, and I sort of ummed and ahed a bit. And these other heads of information who are around the table, absolutely loving it, because here's this upstart who's been put on the spot, doesn't have a clue what he's talking about. No one's going to help me out. So I ummed and ahed and mumbled and said something or other about the security screen is being removed in job centres or something. And he said, well, Peter, that's sort of right. He said, but that's process. I'm talking about people. Unemployed people are now treated as human beings, and this for him was a sort of encapsulation of the Citizens Charter and what he stood for. And I remember going home that night and lying in bed and just thinking, I've been in number 10 Downing Street for dinner. The Prime Minister's asked me a question. I didn't have a clue what he was talking about. There are all these people out to get me, and I just blew it. And that was a really dark and low point.
But what a great story. But what did you learn from that shaped you as a leader since then?
Well, don't make assumptions that people know the answer to questions, that you've got to put them forward. That relationships, are in a particular moment in time. Don't pretend things that you don't really know. So I was careful to give an answer that I thought was sort of in the right place. Be confident in yourself. So the next day when I went into the office, I replayed the whole thing to Michael Portillo, who is my Secretary of State, and I put him on the spot in exactly the same way and said, what is it in your department that has happened that epitomizes the brilliance of this government? And he looked. He
didn't know that.
What? And I said, unemployed people are treated as human beings. And he said, oh, I suppose they are. And then later that day, we had the Chief Executive of the Employment Service come in for a meeting, and Michael Portillo asked him exactly the same question you've asked me, and he didn't know either. And so something I really learned from him was that he was hugely supportive and loyal to me in those circumstances, and felt that it was an unfair question. And he didn't just kind of say that and move on to the next thing. By taking that action with the Chief Executive of the Employment Service and us all making a bit of a kind of joke about it, but also taking some kind of pride in the fact that of all the things that the Prime Minister could have referenced, it was something which really belonged to this department. So there was, at the heart of all of this, there was a really good thing. And then the Chief Executive of the Employment Service could forget all that rubbish and nonsense and the useless attempt that the head of information made to advertise how brilliant the department was. He could simply go off and tell everyone in the job centre network how proud he was of their great work and how they were changing the culture in the job centres.
Yeah. What a great story. I will always remember that one. Thank you, Peter. And so as you're now dealing with children, thinking back to yourself as a young adult, 16 years old, let's say, knowing what you know now, particularly having worked in this field so long, if there was one bit of advice, if you travel back in a time machine and saw the young Peter Wanless, what would you tell yourself to focus on and not worry about?
I would say to be yourself and be confident in yourself and follow your interests, which actually lots of young people don't do, but I really did. But I didn't know how important that was at the time. And I could very easily have been led astray by trying to impress other people or be someone that I wasn't. But I followed my ambitions and my interests. I really, really loved cricket, so I applied to universities in cities that had Test cricket grounds. I picked a course in modern history and politics, because that was what I was really interested in. I went to London and I lived in the most horrendous bedsit when I look back and think about it now. I would never subject my son to living in that sort of squalor, but I really wanted to work in the cabinet office at that point, and I wanted to live in London. I've been overwhelmingly true to myself and followed my interests. I think I stayed in government longer than I really needed to, because they kept giving me really interesting things to do, and more and more responsibility, to the point where I suddenly thought, hang on a minute, I'm being exploited here. I could be doing something where I have more opportunity to shape the values and the culture and the context around doing. But essentially, that following your instincts really matters, and don't be afraid of failure. Another thing, this sounds really trivial, but it was really important to me that age 17 and a half, I failed my driving test, because I couldn't believe it when that happened. I thought I was completely indestructible and I could do anything. And when this person sat next to me and said, well, Mr. Wanless, I'm afraid you haven't reached the standard competent to be in charge of a motor vehicle, it's like the end of the world. And I thought, who are you to say that? How can you possibly think that I am not the most brilliant driver ever? And I just kind of sped round the course, to the point where they ended up having to ask me about 15 highway code questions instead of 3, because I've been going at 45 miles an hour instead of 30, or whatever it might be. But that really brought me down to earth. And then my dad did really help me to say, well, you know, it's not the end of the world. You can take it again in a month and calm down and put things in perspective. And so that early experience of failure in something that that mattered, but it didn't matter that much.
Yeah, no, it's a lovely way. I think it's really quite important. Even now, I remember a time when I was trying to do public speaking. I was very anxious, and someone said to me, just go out there and fail. Just go and be an absolute disaster on stage. And actually I wasn't, but I was prepared to, and I could accept that it may be pretty poor. And I think that the willingness to fail and learn from it almost releases you from holding yourself to account. Going back to your topic about morals and integrity and things like that you've talked about, we'll perhaps go around the Inspiring Leadership Compass, the eight points of the compass, and begin with moral quotient, the integrity values, the foundational values. You know, you've worked in the world of politicians, which when my friend Professor Roger Steer was doing the moral DNA, he finds it hard to get politicians to fill it in. But other sectors, you know what their moral DNA is. And you've met some politicians who have a very strong moral code. And as we're seeing in the news at the moment, you meet some politicians who have a very movable true north, which seems to adapt depending on where they are to circumstances. What's been your sort of top tip about values and beliefs, and what have you learned from sort of working with politicians, some who have strong moral codes, and you might want to mention some who you won't mention, but were disappointing?
Well, firstly, I would say that overwhelmingly the politicians that I've worked with have been in it for the right reasons, and they've been incredibly driven. They've been a bit more. I could never be I don't think I could ever be a party political person, because I'm too good at seeing other perspectives. But subject to that kind of drive and uncompromising sense of direction, which sometimes I sort of struggle with as a citizen. I never watch Question Time, because it just does my head in that you know what most party politicians are going to say before they've opened their mouths. It would be a much more interesting program if you had charity chief executives on Question Time more often. But that's another story. But overwhelmingly, I think, you know, the purpose and the desire to make positive change, I have seen in almost without exception the politicians that I have worked with. And the challenge has been to furnish them with the arguments and the and the preparation and the context that they need to advance that agenda that they believe passionately in. And that honesty and the ability to tell truth to power really matters. And I've enjoyed the kind of hurly-burly and the cut and thrust of having those conversations with politicians, which I have found that they have respected. I think it's become very much harder to do in the sort of modern world where everything is moving so much faster, and there seem to be no kind of secrets or safe spaces, to have those conversations and to think aloud. Without them popping up because someone has said almost before the cabinet meeting is finished. People are rushing to say who has said what and to get their version. I think that's really difficult to deal with, and I don't envy the politicians or the civil servants operating in that context now. But I think politicians on the whole get a bad press. One that I was really there's lots of them that I could talk positively about, actually.
If you pick one, who would you pick?
Well, for a particular reason, I think Estelle Morris was a really great Secretary of State for Education, because she had really kind of strong values grounded in the classroom and what children thought and felt and what teachers thought and felt. And the fact that her background was in the profession, I think, made her an incredibly well-informed and grounded Secretary of State, which is ironic because she's about the only Secretary of State I can think of who resigned because she said she didn't feel she was up to the job.
Wow.
Which is strange, isn't it? Because I thought she was inspirational in her kind of engagement and emotional association with what the government was seeking to achieve at that time.
And really that takes me on nicely to the next element, which is PQ, meaning and purpose. So vocation, a calling, a dharma, if you were speaking about it from Indian background. What gives you your sense of meaning and purpose in the life you've led thus far and are currently doing?
Well, I think this sense of being able to make a positive difference to children, to see young lives that have been desperately badly damaged through no fault of those children, and to be able to draw attention to that, to demand change and to provide positive change, and not to do that because I am kind of clever or more driven than anyone else, but because of this incredible privilege that I have to sit at the front of this extraordinary family that is the NSPCC. So literally hundreds of thousands of people from all sorts of walks of life who say we dislike cruelty to children and we want to do something about it. So my authority and ability to influence comes from their passion and their many and varied purposes. If we line them up, they'll have all sorts of different views about what should be done, when and why. And one of the hardest issues in this job is to synthesize the specific priorities and areas of attention where the NSPCC can make most unique and distinct contribution. But it's that that sense of collective endeavor and the opportunity to represent all these people who share a passion that gives me real purpose. And as a leader, I enjoy building coalitions and alliances of unlikely perspectives together to achieve more than those people ever imagine that they can do on their own, and that's what the NSPCC is all about.
You remind me when I worked for Field Marshal the Lord Inge, Peter Inge, when he was head of the army, and I was in his private office, I suppose you'd call it that, but I was just the ADC, the bag carrier, and but I saw him talk about the coalition of the willing, getting a group of people who are willing to contribute. And I thought that was a very powerful statement. Talking about the different people you've been with, you are leading through an endemic, because it's not going to be here just for a short time and then over. It's going to be with us for some time. Health quotient, mental health, physical health, well-being. What about how you looked after your own health and well-being, mentally and physically? And you're laughing. And also the health of your organization and your team, how the people look after themselves as they're under such mental strain.
Well, I'm laughing because you know, Jonathan, that there have been times when we've had conversations, you've been banging on to me about the importance of sleep and the importance of exercise, and I don't really value those things in the context of everything else that is going on. And I don't know if that's about luck or what, but when something gives, the thing that gives is my looking after myself in normal circumstances. Now, as it happens, during this prolonged kind of lockdown and period of social isolation, I did see myself getting larger and larger and heavier and wider and wider. And I told myself I've got to do something. So I have done couch to 5K, and I do now run from time to time, and not only under a sort of sense of obligation. I really believe in leading a life of variety, and I think as chief executive we are hugely privileged in our ability to dip in and out of all sorts of issues and all sorts of aspects and dimensions of an organization. So I think that is really good for my health and well-being. Being a chief executive suits me. As you've referenced earlier, I love cricket. I watch a lot of cricket online, in real life. I think about it, I read about it. I'm a complete badger when it comes to that sport. I love music. I love watching box sets of one kind or another. So I keep myself healthy by not concentrating on a single issue and obsessing for long periods of time. So some people clear their minds by going for a long run or a long bike ride, and I think I clear my mind by thinking about cricket or watching cricket or watching Succession or whatever that might be. I have recognized through the pandemic that the well-being of our people is vitally important, and if I reflect on the relative importance I attach to that whole issue of the wider well-being of volunteers and staff prior to the pandemic, I think I have learned through this period that paying diligent attention to that really matters. And so going back to those principles of the children and the people and the finances, that isn't always the leader I have been. I've had I spent the first few years of my life, as you've heard, in the Treasury. So the finances have sometimes taken greater priority over the people, perhaps. They all really matter. And when you're running an organization that depends 90% on voluntary donations, if you're not spending a lot of time thinking about the money, you've got a problem. But I think that sort of systematic regard for the well-being of people and appreciating and understanding, if it's not cricket that they need, if they haven't got the privilege and the variety of job that I have got, where do they get their release from? Really matters.
And there's no doubt about it. I've seen many of the leaders I've talked to, either they themselves have had mental health issues exacerbated during this period, or they've got a number of their people whose mental health has suffered. But on a more lighter note, you reminded me back of a good old friend of mine, Alistair Matheson, who was a very urbane Oxford University sort of academic officer in the Scots Guards. And I was in Cyprus doing the mountain marathon training for it and constantly running. And I went out one morning and Alistair was in his in his sort of Panama and sort of blazer and things. I said, "Oh, so are you going to come out for a run?" And he goes, "Run, Jonathan? Officers don't run. It panics the men." And so, yeah, he put me in my place. EQ.
One of the things you didn't mention in my CV, which actually was really important to my development and understanding of leadership, was I did the advanced management program at INSEAD.
Oh, wow.
And I was exposed there to leaders from all sorts of other walks of life. You know, there were 80 of us, and there were only 2 people from the public sector across the globe, me and someone responsible for the Singapore sewage system. And I remember a particular Belgian banker who was on that program, and we were encouraged to think about health management on that course. And for a while, I drank a lot of water, and I did get my heart rate up for 30 minutes every day. And I did do my 3-minute workout when I got up in the morning. And these were really good sort of disciplines. But this chap, he was similar. He sort of said he was not at all interested in sport, and he wasn't going to do any sport ever, because if you did sport, you got injured. And too many of his people were taking time off because they were injured. But he did agree that a couple of glasses of wine, red wine a day minimum, was a vital part of the program.
Yeah, and it's since been proved that a little bit of red wine in the right portions can help in some cases. EQ, emotional and social intelligence. You've worked with and come across a lot of particularly bright people who sometimes are not so aware of their impact on other people, or can't read other people like a language. They're just not picking up what goes on. It's perhaps a skill they haven't developed, either through birth or just the environment they've been in, where IQ has been valued far more than EQ. But what have you done to learn about reading people, picking up that Fingerspitzgefühl, as the Germans call it, the fingertip feel about people, or the mood of a room, or what the organization's like? What have you done to develop that?
So this is a really interesting one. I think one-to-one with people of extreme influence, I learned that from a very early age, because I was working with politicians. So my kind of instincts and understanding and ability to get where the boss is coming from, or what the power shift needs to be to influence something, both intellectually and emotionally for that individual, I've had loads of experience of. As I kind of grew out and into organizations where I needed to build teams that knew and understood one another and appreciated one another, that reading of the room, that ability to see and understand and appreciate people's motivations, I'm in awe of people that do that, and I've found people that can do it really well, and I've learned from them. And the other thing that you get in the NSPCC, of course, is all these incredible social workers and therapists whose job is absolutely professionally to know and understand and appreciate people's feelings. So I've kind of got them around me, both to remind me and advise me on that sort of stuff. Because as an individual myself, my instinct is to appreciate intellectually the vital importance of understanding people's emotions, as opposed to naturally appreciated people's emotions. I'm sure Lady Wanless would confirm this.
That's a lovely way of putting it. And then taking it from emotional and social intelligence on one-to-one people, the what do we call cultural quotient, which is we've brought that in as an element rather than IQ, which is still important, but I think these days cultural intelligence quotient, the ability to recognize diversity, equality, and inclusion of different cultures, different people, different societies, different countries. You're having to deal with this all the time. What's been your learning about reading a culture of an environment, or different ethnic backgrounds, or whatever it might be?
So I think I've recognized for a long time, and the INSEAD experience was a really good kind of illustrator of that, actually appreciating and understanding people from all sorts of different cultures and all sorts of different business disciplines, and everyone was very different from me, and we did a lot of kind of deliberative thinking about how you build teams with different sorts of skills. In the NSPCC, we're doing a lot of deliberate work now around inclusive leadership and asking ourselves how do you build a really kind of inclusive and diverse culture, and I've got sort of 3 points on a triangle which we're paying attention to really. So one is the diversity that you've referenced. So where and how can we access diversity of personal experience and history, professional experience and history, experiential experience and history, and institutional experience and history. So that's one big kind of cluster of things. Secondly, we've been doing as senior leaders sort of 360 feedback on inclusive qualities. So in some ways, it doesn't matter what I think about my authenticity, my collaborative working, the degree to which I create a sort of sense of belonging, compassion, courage. What do other people experience of that? So we're trying to create a lot of intelligence and insight around those aspects of inclusive leadership, so we can talk to one another as a team about what we are getting from one another. And then thirdly, that more sort of how to create a culture of safety in the organization, so people feel that this is a place where they belong and have a home. And none of this is at all straightforward, and I don't pretend for a minute that I or the NSPCC have got it cracked, but I think, you know, a lot of deliberate time is being spent by us as a leadership team now thinking about these things, whereas the temptation is, because our work is so urgent and so important and so vital for children who need us now and of this moment, and because we can kind of bang the drum about the moral purpose and the urgent need and vital salience of our mission, which is lots of people will agree with, if you're not careful, you can race towards the mission and use that as an excuse to forgive all sorts of suboptimal behaviors and cultural issues of one kind or another.
It's a really good point you make, and particularly these days, psychological safety for people in an organization, in a team, not only just for the children and the environment they're in, but people that can actually speak out and say what needs to be said without fear of retribution or an impact on them. Going from that on to the next element of the Inspiring Leadership Compass, what makes inspiring leaders and high-performing leaders, because it's linked to performance. You and I have spoken before about resilience against adversity. And I'm not just talking about when at 17 and a half, you get told that you're not the world's greatest motor racing driver and you have failed. But when you haven't had your way and you've had setbacks or challenges as a CEO of a charity for the last 8 years, and you get knocked back and you think you've just got it going and things don't work out. I was telling you about enjoying Sir Ernest Shackleton's book about the Endeavour, and it stuck in the pack ice and he didn't make it across. And then they had to try and escape on a bit of ice floes and they kept almost dying and almost losing people, but he kept his whole team together. Then they got to Elephant Island. Then they had to get South Georgia in a 20-foot long boat in the worst seas in the world. And they somehow, with a tiny little sextant, they managed to make it. If they missed it, they were gone. The next place was South Africa. And thank God they made it. But they landed on the wrong side of the island. And they had to go over the mountains on a route that no one has ever done since 1955. They did it with polar explorers and mountain gear. And they said they did it with a 20-foot rope and some boots with some nails dragged in. So that is adversity and resilience. But what's been your, I don't know, your top tip about resilience?
So I've got two really, and both of them I need to remind myself of on a regular basis, because life is not as extreme as you described, but leadership is all sorts of things going wrong and needing to kind of face up to new challenges the entire time. So the first kind of tip or insight is, if it were easy, they wouldn't need to employ you to be the leader of this complicated organization. So kind of, get over it, what do you think you're there for if it's not to help people resolve and work through these problems? That's why you've been employed. And that's really easy for me to say back to you, but it's you need someone to remind you of that on a pretty regular basis. And that links to my second point, which is at moments when I've been at the point of almost feeling kind of overwhelmed or not able to see my way through something. Becky, who now to be referred to as Lady Wanless, is not really interested in the detail of what I'm up to. She has completely different interests and gets on with her life. So we're not the sort of kind of couple who sit around the table and discuss in great detail the issues and challenges of the nation and what the NSPCC needs and wants to do. But she's just really good at saying to me in moments like that, you're doing your best. You're good at what you do. So thank you very much.
Yeah, that's
I love you too.
That's a lovely support.
Yeah, and that's really helpful. So having someone, whoever that might be, who you respect, who just reminds you that you're trying as hard as you can and you're doing the best you can, and what more can people ask for? And if they're not happy with it, then don't be happy with them. Go off and do something else.
Yeah,
Really
help them find help them find their happiness elsewhere was a term one of my friends used to help them just go where they want to be. The last two of the compass before we talk about executive teams, the book, and then the top tips is you've done 360 and had feedback on yourself. Brand, I'm thinking about brand, personal brand, reputation.
Yeah.
What have you learned when you've done 360 about whether it's useful, whether it was valuable to you, and how you encourage others to do
that? I think it is useful when you get over the initial sort of instinct of, why did they say that about me? Who was it? I must find them. One of the things that I have learned is that and I've had this a number of times, it's another one you just need to be reminded of. I think of myself as a really kind of open and available leader, and any problem, come and talk to me about it. We can work it through. And I constantly underestimate, and this gets more acute, the higher up an organization you go. And God, imagine being a knight of the realm, and people decided to kind of take the initiative to come and talk to you about some little problem or concern they've got. It's not as simple as just saying, I'm available. Because some people, more extrovert characters, will really take advantage of that, and other people will kind of sit back and feel a bit, not take advantage of it, and then you get unequal levels of engagement across an organization. So a 360 lesson to me is always to try and put myself into places that I'm not expected to be, and show people who I am, and not make it all their responsibility. Effective communication is a two-way thing.
Yeah, that's very good. And then clearly the NSPCC is all about legacy, leaving the legacy for each single child, that their life is better than it would have been, and the cruelty and the unfortunate situations they were born into or found themselves in.
Yeah.
But what would you like your legacy to be? Just as CEO of the NSPCC, what is it you hope you would leave behind you that's better in the stewardship than you found it?
I think a really strong sense of connection between the kind of soul and purpose of what the charity is about and the actions that we are taking is one. I want to protect the authority and authenticity of the brand, so that when there are conversations about the abuse and neglect of children, the NSPCC's expertise and insight is drawn upon. And I think we're doing well at that, but there's no guarantee or reason why we should be listened to. We're tiny in relation to the overall child protection system, so we've got to build and retain that that credibility, and good reputation can be lost overnight, as we know.
Mm-hmm.
So sustaining that is really important, and I think just maintaining this sort of sense of the NSPCC belonging to the people. I am the temporary steward who is connecting all these incredible people who want to make a positive difference to children with all these children whose lives can be improved as a consequence of what they're up to. So to keep that kind of transmission mechanism really strong for the next leader.
That's great. And then let's talk about teams. I mean, we could talk about cricket teams, but I think you might, I'm sure you'll throw in an analogy or two about cricket into this one. But you at times will have inherited in different roles that you've done, a team that's slightly toxic, with maybe an individual or two who turns the team so there's a lack of trust and they're not collaborating and helping each other and they're a bit on their own agendas, or someone does something which really breaks the sense of psychological safety that you're so keen on having. What have you done that's taken it from being any, and clearly don't mention the guilty, but just any stage of your career, what have you seen that's worked well, or taking it from toxic to high performing?
Well, better out than in is really important. So if people are seeing and experiencing something, they need to vocalize that, and it then has to be dealt with, or the team has to change. Creating the safe space in which people can ideally share with one another if there's an erosion of trust or respect, but if not, as the leader, you have a responsibility to help them get that out. And there have been occasions when I have deliberately worked through with people, what is it about this individual that you don't trust? What is it that they need to do for you to appreciate the contribution they're seeking to make to the organization? And that can work really well. And if it doesn't work really well, then you need to take another route. But what you can't tolerate is prolonged periods of individuals seeing themselves as more important than the home team.
Yeah, no, that's a lovely way of putting it. Penultimate question is a good book that you've read on leadership in the last couple of years that you think people would enjoy, and it can't be a cricket book.
See, so I really don't read leadership books, and it's back to this sort of having the variety in my life. I can't think of anything. I prefer to get your latest 20 tips, Jonathan, synthesized for me so that I can read detective novels or cricket books.
But no, let's stay with that. Joking aside, I stopped you there because actually we draw on learning for the way we lead from many areas. So if you were to pick something that's been quite influential on the way you show up as a leader from any kind of book, what would it be recently?
Yeah. Well, I will go to a leadership book because I haven't read it, but I read an article in the paper which came from it, and that was Matthew Syed's Rebel Ideas, and he talked about teams that spend too much time agreeing with one another, and as opposed to teams that have diversity of opinion and argue out a solution, which sometimes might need to be taken through by majority vote. And he makes an observation in that particular bit of the book that even though people might feel a little bit unhappier and less good about themselves and the way forward in the diverse group, the decision is better. And I took some considerable comfort from that, because if I go back to myself as that leader back in the kind of head of information days, when I suddenly inherited all these people, and I didn't really have a great deal of experience of of managing large teams, my instinct was then always to try and find the kind of common ground and make people happy and build consensus. And that's what I bring to this kind of coalition building of trying to get, you know, the willing together to better meet the needs of children. But when you're running an organization, you've got to have that really gritty conversation. You've got to learn how to disagree well with one another, and if that means people do feel a little bit uncomfortable with one another because they don't always arrive at the same route, that is okay, because Matthew tells me from his research that that's better for children, and that's really good for me, because fundamentally I want to do the best thing we possibly can for children. That's more important than everyone feeling happy at the end of the meeting.
Yeah, very good. Well, before we go into the top tip, I'm going to just ask you a curveball one. You have a wonderful wild dress sense, and here we are, for those who can watch the video, with you and your amazing shirt that you're wearing today, or a top. Yeah, that's fantastic. And you've also been on some great interviews that you've done. You're about to do an interesting one. What have been a couple of the interesting ones? The next one included interviews that you've done asking you about your views on your particular charity and your views on it.
Oh, I've met all sorts of interesting people. Quite recently, we did a sort of exclusive event where we had Alistair Campbell come along and talk about mental health and well-being, but we got him to play the bagpipes at the end, and he played the European national anthem on his bagpipes, which, you know, that's really entertaining in and of itself. But in terms of a kind of fundraising or special experience for a charity, that's like gold dust. So to get people along and then see, so he kind of went the extra mile for us. That was really good. I don't know very much about rugby at all, but I've learned a lot more as a consequence of the many generous people from the world of rugby who support NSPCC. And I sat next to Johnny Wilkinson once, and he had a real aura about him, and he's deeply interested in some of these motivational things and how you find calmness at moments of really heightened tension, and that's so that was a fascinating opportunity. There are loads of them.
Yeah, you've been very lucky, and you've made your luck, and you've gone out there to create some amazing events that raise with colleagues who've come up with the ideas, but you've backed them. So I congratulate you on that. So let's go to your final top tip, and then we'll just say goodbye at the end of that. But if you just introduce yourself again, Sir Peter, and share your top tip.
Okay, so I'm Sir Peter Wanless. I'm the Chief Executive of the NSPCC. My top tip would be that in any situation, as a leader, you bring energy, and it can be positive and supportive and enabling of people, or it can be negative and corrosive of any situation. And in my experience, showing up with positive energy gets the best out of people.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Sir Peter Wanless. It's been fantastic having you on the Inspiring Leadership series. I wish you every success with the work you're doing with your colleagues with the NSPCC. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jonathan.